From the very beginning, from Eden, God engaged in Adventist education. We like to talk about the institutions that came out of Eden. Some say the Sabbath and marriage. But education was there as well, because God Himself taught Adam and Eve. Theirs was an existence. Their daily walk with God was an educational walk. He taught them who He was, or who He is. He taught them who they are. He taught them where they came from. Their history was important, that they were formed by God's own hand. Can you imagine hearing that, being taught that? That's Adventist education.
Genesis 1 and 2 tell us about the perfection in which God made us. And Genesis chapter 3 tells us about how we have fallen and been broken. And the rest of the Bible is God's story about how to bring us back. And so Adventist education is part of the story of God bringing us back to what He made us.
The work of education and the work of redemption are one, the same job, to restore the image of God in human beings. That's the sum philosophy of Adventist education, and it encompasses all of human experience from childhood to being an older person. It even passes beyond this life, though, into the life to come.
Education has to play into the entire understanding of how you lift people from where they are. We are saved by grace, but God then begins to work in a life to help us understand better and better what Christian living is all about. Seventh-day Adventist education is instrumental in helping young people to understand what the elements of life are all about, physically, mentally, socially, and of course spiritually. And that way, Seventh-day Adventist education was foremost in helping young people in the very beginning of the church learn about the essentials of what it is to be a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. And also, it was a foundation to help train young people to go out in mission for the church.
Lançar o olhar para o passado é mais que só uma lembrança. É uma questão de identidade. É reconhecer quem somos, da onde viemos e, o mais importante, repensar para onde vamos. Esta pequena vila histórica em Battle Creek, Michigan, nos traslada para a época na qual a Igreja Adventista do Sétimo Dia foi organizada. Primeiramente, recebendo seu nome em 1860, para logo se organizar oficialmente nesse edifício em 1863.
The Adventist Church finds its genesis, its roots, in the movement of William Miller that climaxed in 1844. Miller had taught that Jesus would come about the year 1843, but they corrected it to 1844. But guess what? Jesus didn't come. And for the next few years, there was absolute confusion. But then three people began to put together some theological understandings based upon Millerite understanding. And that was Joseph Bates, James White, and a young girl by the name of Ellen White. And by 1848, they'd put together, pretty much studied out of the Bible, the great doctrines of the Sabbath and the sanctuary and the second coming and the state of the dead and the three angels' messages. And then they began to gather in a people. There's only one problem. These people didn't want to be organized. And so it would not be until 1861 that they even had a name. And they chose the name Seventh-day Adventists.
Once Adventists discovered who they were, they had to determine what a human being was. And of course, this has to do with the doctrine of the non-immortality of the soul. But Adventists determined that a human was comprised of body, soul, and spirit. And that in order to educate a person, there had to be physical, mental, moral, and spiritual education. Now, of course, our doctrines and our emphasis already touched on the health of a person, the spirituality of the person. And so education would take into mind the whole man.
Adventist education has its roots in the fact that Seventh-day Adventism is a unique set of doctrines and beliefs. And in its initial years, before the church was actually organized in 1863, of course, education isn't at the top of the minds of our pioneers because they themselves are focusing on working out beliefs for themselves. But once the church is formed and once it's been around for a number of years, then inevitably you face the problem, what happens to our children?
There were individuals who were really concerned about Adventists sending their children to public schools. As late as about 1862, there were challenges against Adventist education because remember, those who had come into our movement at that time felt that Jesus was coming any day. And so they felt there was no need for education. So out of that context, with many feeling there's no need, and others feeling, well, while we're here, we should do something, slowly but steadily, we moved toward a particular design.
Adventist education was really not planned at first. Initially, it was more of a localized thing.
For the first several years, it was very spotty. By that I mean we had a school here and it would close and then maybe somebody else would open a school. It was not very continuous. There was no organized, formal plan, no education department or anything like that.
It was not really a focus in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was more, what do we need to do to get this new worker in the field? So they might go with someone. There would be some young ministers or new ministers who would travel with other ministers and they would learn that way. So it was almost more on-the-job training, and education was focused towards the mission of the church. Of course, children were important, and this is why you had some of these smaller schools and you had some homeschooling things happening.
Fé é a certeza do que se espera, a esperança naquilo que não se vê. Fé que permeia cada aspecto de nossas vidas, esperança que vive em quem compartilha. Fé que, fundamentada desde a infância, constitui a maior esperança de construir futuro melhor.
One of the first schools was in Bucks Bridge, New York, way up north in St. Lawrence County. There was a 17-year-old redheaded girl named Martha Byington. and she had just finished 8 grades of education herself. Her family had just converted to Seventh-day Adventism in 1852. Her father, John, would be a future General Conference president. And her cousins, the Hilliards, were also interested in having school for their young people. So altogether, there were probably about 15 or 20 young people in the area. And John Byington is supposed to have said to his nephew, Aaron Hilliard, "I will donate my daughter to this cause. What will you give?" And Aaron Hilliard said, "I will devote my parlor for the school." And so together they worked on creating some benches and tables for this school. And Martha began teaching during the winter. I think it was probably December of 1853. And that school continued for at least 3 years. Martha went off to get some more education the next year at what was called Potsdam Academy. And so other members of the Hilliard family took over. But many of her students became missionaries around the world. And so from that tiny little beginning in Bucks Bridge, there was a worldwide influence.
Em pouco tempo, estas iniciativas locais originaram expectativas globais. Aquilo que no princípio somente poucos defenderam com coragem, compromisso e esforço, passaria a ser parte fundamental e indiscutível da mensagem adventista do sétimo dia.
In Battle Creek, the church had made a very strong start already and was beginning to gather all of the various parts of their ministry together in Battle Creek. They had a publishing house there, they had the Health Institute there, and of course the church headquarters were in Battle Creek, but there was no school. They tried on several occasions to start a church school, but those were sort of unofficial, informal attempts to start to teach the children who were part of the community there in Battle Creek. And then in about 1872, some of the young people who were working at the publishing house, at the Review and Herald, became aware that there was a man who was there in Battle Creek who was a teacher. His name was Goodloe Harper Bell.
Goodloe Harper Bell was a patient in the sanitarium, or the Health Reform Institute. It wasn't called the sanitarium yet. And he was an educator. He had been to Oberlin College in Ohio. He had wrecked his health. He came to try to get his health back. But Bell's out there chopping wood and doing things to get his health back, chopping wood for the fires to stoke the steam presses that operated the Review and Herald. And one day he got talking to some kids, came by, and they said they hated school. They hated English, especially grammar. It was terrible. And they went on, and he said, when properly understood, grammar is the most exciting topic or subject at all in school.
He told them that if it was taught properly, English grammar was the most exciting subject in the world. And that was typical of his enthusiasm for his subject matter.
Professor Bell was a very structured, organized man, very disciplined, and he did this for his students as well. We have here at the center some of his materials, his papers, and he required very careful penmanship. He required careful elocution. You had to speak just right. You had to write just right. He also taught English, so you have Bible in English and other subjects. And he began a little school in Battle Creek.
They went to him and asked him if he would teach them after hours when they were done working. They were eager to learn. And he was very enthusiastic and passionate about being a teacher. He told, it was actually James and Ellen White's son who went to ask him if he would teach them.
This 1868 school was in a very dilapidated building. It was inadequate on a material level in a lot of ways, but yet it had this small group of students that would be later leaders in the church. I mean, among them were the two White boys, James Edson White and W.C. White, which were Ellen White and James White's sons. And then there were the two of the Kellogg brothers. You had both John Harvey Kellogg and W.K. Kellogg. And then there were others. So these were the students of Professor Bell. And so this school continued and it grew. In fact, when you look at just the year before or so, before 1874, when we start the college, this school has grown to over 100 students. And how can you can't manage it. The facilities are inadequate, everything's inadequate, but the desire, the longing to do this education has grown to the point that they had to step forward with education.
Foi aqui em Battle Creek que se iniciou a primeira campanha evangelística, em 1854. O primeiro edifício próprio da Casa Publicadora, em 1855. O primeiro centro de saúde, em 1866. E, finalmente, a primeira escola, em 1872, que se tornaria uma universidade, em 1874, iniciando assim uma rede educativa de proporções mundiais.
As the church begins to mature in the late 1860s, Adventists become aware of the fact, now that we've organized and we've created a structure and we have pastors, we need more than that. We need to have a system by which we can educate our children and allow them to grow up in the faith. Because if we send them to outside schools, there's a grave danger that we may lose them.
The pioneers of the church, those early leaders that we know, were trying to conceptualize what would be needed to help Adventist children, one, to grow up to be Adventist, and then to become missionary-minded workers for the church, either working for the church or working in the community outside.
The early church knew Jesus was coming back, and they wanted a gospel that was well-informed, one that could communicate to everybody in the world, and they realized right away that simple farmers weren't able to do that as well as people who were trained and educated. People that were shopkeepers didn't have time, and so they wanted people out there with the best skills possible, I think, so that they could make sure the world was ready for the Lord to come. I think as the Lord didn't come in those early years, the movement into realizing that education for educating the whole person was just as important so that we could go out and do mission work around the world.
El concepto de educar surge una vez que los pioneros entienden la realidad de que el Evangelio de Jesús debe enviarse a todo el mundo. Y en ese momento entonces surge la pregunta natural, ¿quiénes van a hacer eso? ¿Y en qué medida los podemos entrenar y preparar? Si tenemos que abarcar el mundo, que era un sueño extraordinario, necesitamos obviamente predicadores, pastores, misioneros. ¿Y dónde los vamos a formar?
In the late 60s and the early 70s, they also began to believe that they needed to send missionaries to other countries. You see, they had no missionary vision the first 30 years. No vision. Now, this is hard to believe, because Adventists today are a mission-oriented people. I mean, mission is our middle name. But back then, they had no vision whatsoever. But they began to talk more and more, starting about 1869. We need to send missionaries. Besides that, we need to publish literature in other languages. So we need editors, we need translators, we need teachers, we need ministers. And so they began by the 1874 to have a fairly good understanding of where the future might take them. And so it's no accident that the first Adventist college and the first Adventist foreign missionary were both sent the same year, 1874. Now remember, that is 30 years after the Great Disappointment. So in the beginning, you might say that the Adventists were the anti-education people and the anti-mission people. But that would change.
Finalmente, educar é compartilhar conhecimento, é expandir um pensamento e oferecê-lo a todo aquele que está disposto a ouvir. Aquele que se torna depositário de um paradigma, herdeiro de um legado inestimável que promove o desenvolvimento integral de seus dons com um propósito superior. Uma meta que, mais do que um objetivo particular, compreende uma missão global.
El adventismo captó desde temprano que para mantener la identidad y cumplir su misión debemos mantener un sistema educativo coherente, claro en sus ideas y práctico. Es ahí donde se moldea la mente, en donde se capta la cosmovisión, para decir cómo se entiende esa realidad que vivimos, cómo interpretamos la Biblia, cómo comunicamos este mensaje utilizando los mejores recursos.
Education has been part of our agenda from the very beginning as a missionary movement. We have consistently carried the preaching of the word, evangelism, education, and health ministry. On these three sort of pillars have our service to the public been extended. In education, we are trying to accomplish 2 or 3 different things. We are wanting, obviously, to instill in the minds of particularly young men and women values which are eternal. But we are also equally focused on preparing them for functional roles in society, in the nation where they live here and now.
We believe in a divine calling. It's not just a survey of which jobs pay the highest and how much money one would like to make. It is all about God's call on the life and how we serve other people.
We believe that in order to best serve God and man, that we had to develop ourselves first so that we could be our best for others. And from there, these developed, refined, and polished students could better give the gospel to the world.
Jesus taught his disciples so they could go out and teach other people. So education is implicit in the gospel. And I think that that's why we do a Christian education. If you become a plumber or a carpenter or a nurse or a biochemist or a neuroscientist or a PhD in organic gardening, whatever you decide to do, you can do that with a knowledge that God's at the very center of your life. And that as you do that with other people, they'll see in you something that's unique. They'll see perhaps a peace, a hope, an understanding of the world that would make a difference. And I think that's why education is so implicit in the gospel message.
Education is an invaluable instrument in the hand of the church, and it must be on the agenda of the church in order to help prepare our young people, young professionals to function productively, effectively, creatively in society. There is no other way by which we can shape the mind, the young mind. It's very dexterous, it's very flexible. There is no way of shaping the young mind other than through the instruments of education. We teach, and they will function on the basis of the values that they have been taught. This is it is inconceivable that we should even think of rounding off and completing our mission assignment without giving strong profile to education.
Nenhum começo é fácil, porém, quando o objetivo é nobre e a meta superior, todo o desafio e toda a dificuldade são como neblina que desaparece ao resplandecer sobre ela a brilhante luz da Palavra de Deus.